Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Dan Senor is co-author of the bestseller Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle, which has been translated into more than 30 languages. Dan has been a senior advisor to U.S. presidential campaigns. He was a Pentagon official based in Baghdad and at U.S. Central Command in Qatar. And for his service in these roles, he was awarded the Pentagon's highest civilian honor, the U.S. Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service by the Secretary of Defense. Dan has written for the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post. And he is host of a popular podcast, and I don't miss an episode. It's called Call Me Back. He is an equity partner and chief public affairs officer at Elliott Investment Management, LLC in New York, and he has two very adorable children.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Great to be with you, Abigail.
Great to be with you in very difficult times. Mm-hmm. This book, though, is wonderful and a must-read, The Genius of Israel. And the subtitle, The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. It certainly is that. The reason for this book, you had written Startup Nation, and what I kind of loved when I was preparing for this is that you were kind of like, enough, I don't want to return to that territory. But you were pushed to do it. Why?
We were encouraged by a lot of people to do a sequel to Startup Nation, and that's what Saul, my co-author, and I had been resistant to doing, but we toyed with the idea. A lot had happened in the Israeli innovation economy since we had written Startup Nation, and as we talked to more and more Israeli entrepreneurs, trying to think if we did a sequel, what would it be like? And we talked to a lot of the characters that were from Startup Nation, and we realized in those conversations over the last few years that we had missed a big theme of what makes Israel's innovation economy tick, and really what makes Israel tick. And what we heard over and over from these Israeli entrepreneurs is we could take really big, potentially career-ending risks to build these technology companies because we felt like the country had our back. And they also said part of what motivated us was putting Israel on the map globally. Now, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs around the world. I know a lot of various business people in various tech ecosystems, Silicon Valley, London, Berlin. They're motivated to do great things, but I never hear them say, I was willing to do this because even if I failed, the country had my back. And there was some motivation, a kind of national pride. It was almost a form of patriotism about putting their country on the map globally. And so that's when we started to dive in, like, what is the connection people have to country in Israel, even business people, even very ambitious, some would say ruthless capitalists who are trying to build these, jaw-dropping, innovative companies. What about this country makes them feel so connected to it, so optimistic about it? And so that we sort of dug into that theme, and as we dug into that theme, we realized there was something going on in the health of Israeli society that has nothing to do with the economy. I mean, the economy is a beneficiary of it, but there was something going on in Israeli society that was a complete contrast with the health or lack of health of societies throughout the Western world.
And before we get to kind of the proof text, how do you go about actually putting teeth on that thesis in a way? And that's a mixed metaphor. But so, just even as a reporter, as a journalist.
How do you like go prove it out, right? So we noticed, we started in anecdotal conversations, we were sensing this sense of, as I said, sense of patriotism, a unique form of patriotism in Israel, a unique form of optimism about their country, about their community, about their society, about their role in it. And so we started to talk to different social scientists, epidemiologists, historians. We were like, well, how do you take the measure of a society? We know how to take the measure of an economy. We know how to take the measure of a national security situation, but how do you take the measure of the health of a society? And so a few of the metrics we looked at that we were pointed to were, one, fertility rates. Are people having a lot of kids? Because having children is like the ultimate expression in belief in the future, right? If you are concerned about the future or flat out pessimistic about the future, you may be less likely to want to bring children into that future. We looked at longevity, life expectancy. We looked at, are people leading healthy and long lives? We looked at there's all these loneliness studies. Do people feel, it's an increasing problem in the West, do people feel lonely, increasingly lonely? In Israel, it's the opposite. There's no loneliness epidemic.
You talked about deaths of despair. Explain what those are.
Those are the tough ones. So the two areas that were the hardest for us were the deaths of despair, which, to be honest, was an area that I knew very little about before I embarked on this.
Kind of new to me, and that is suicide.
Deaths from alcohol abuse, substance abuse, drug abuse. In the last couple of decades, it's largely been opioids, and suicide. Now, we in the United States have had this epidemic of deaths of despair. It was a term applied or created by these two social scientists and political scientists who had dug into this and saw that much bigger than COVID, much bigger than any other health crisis in this country, these deaths of despair have been killing more and more and more Americans over the last couple of decades. It's all throughout the West. It's in Canada, it's in the UK. US is a little ahead of other countries. So we looked at deaths of despair as a symptom of a broader societal crisis. Israel has no deaths of despair. I mean, I'm not saying they don't have a handful, but a statistically insignificant number. We looked at the mental health crisis. So the CDC, I mean, we've been hearing about a mental health crisis in the United States, which dovetails with a loneliness crisis. And then we've been hearing about a teen mental health crisis over the last few years that predates COVID, although COVID, accelerated the proliferation of this mental health crisis among teens. Mm-hmm. And then the worst term I learned in this process, which I never thought I would hear as the father of teenage boys, which the CDC came out with while we were working on the book, which was declaring that the United States had a teen suicide crisis. So it's not just a teen mental health crisis, it is a teen suicide crisis. We have young people either taking their lives or trying to take their lives in record numbers like we've never seen before. So again, not the sign of a healthy society. And so that was another set of data we looked at. And the last data set we looked at, which is also one I never thought I would focus on, which is this ranking that the UN does every year, ranking the happiest countries in the world. Now, I've always thought this whole notion of which countries are happy and which ones aren't was sort of a slipper.
Flimsy.
Yeah. As I dug into it and spoke to a number of happiness experts, it is a category.
It is a specialty.
What you realize what they're looking at when they survey countries about the happiness, the self-described happiness of a population, is not actual the way you and I think of happy people walking around with, smiley faces. Hey, isn't everything great? It's about life satisfaction. Mm-hmm. So do people feel like they are leading satisfactory lives, and that their families are, and so we start to try to understand, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to lead you're leading a life of satisfaction? So we tried to dig into what that meant, and then we were struck that Israel was ranked, when we first started looking at that, in the top 15 in the world, then the top 10. In 2023, it was number 4. Israel, the 4th happiest country in the world. And when you look at the other countries on the list, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, I mean, you're like, what do all these countries have in common that this one doesn't? There was no country like Israel in a war-torn region, in a country that is deeply divided along political lines, and deeply polarized, and noisy, and contentious, and expensive. Tel Aviv is one of the most expensive cities in the world. According to The Economist, it's the most expensive city in the world. Israel is not, as you know, having been there, is not an easy place to live. Right. So why would Israelis be describing themselves among the top 5 happiest or most satisfied people in the world? So all these strings of data I'm telling you about, these threads, each one could be its own book, and we just tried to pull them all together and see what can explain what's going on here. Because what we learned, and I can go through the data, is on every one of these metrics, the Western affluent democratic world is moving in a very bad direction. Increased rates of loneliness, obviously, as I mentioned, increased rates of mental health crises, teen suicide, increasing rates of loneliness, life expectancy is at best plateauing, deaths of despair on the rise, like a real epidemic, and people just generally self-reporting as leading unhappy or unsatisfactory lives. And then the fertility crisis, which is meaning people are just choosing to have fewer and fewer children. So populations, it's a demography crisis. It's not a fertility crisis, it's a demography crisis. People are populations, because of people's decisions, are shrinking. For the first time, we've really ever seen this in modern history. Some countries are at the pointy end of the spear on this, like Japan or Italy and Japan, just to put this in context, these are populations that have aging and shrinking populations, which is a death spiral economically and for the kind of societal health and social capital of a country, to have a country that's getting smaller and older and older.
I loved the anecdote that adult diapers in Japan outnumber baby diapers.
Yeah.
That was...
It's jarring.
Focuses the mind.
Right. The market for adult diapers is if you want to invest in diapers, in the diaper industry in Japan, you bet on adult diapers, not baby diapers. Italy's not far behind. The rest of Europe is not that far behind. And I hate to say this, but the United States is not that far behind Europe. So we in modern times have never, there's no precedent for this, where whole populations are aging and shrinking. And like I said, on every one of these metrics, Israel's moving in the opposite direction.
You have a quote from a TV executive in Israel who said, part of what counters the loneliness is the sort of over-connection that Israelis have. And I love this quote: "We overshare. We go into details. There is no sense of privacy, and there are no boundaries between work and home. It's a recipe for love and conflict." Can you, again, it's hard to, in a way, codify this, but you sort of know it as you describe it.
Yeah.
Like, what does that lead to? That kind of like a sense that everyone's your family.
Yeah. The first chapter in the book, after the introduction, is we tell the story of Space IL, the Bereshit space project, where three young entrepreneurs, scientist types, decided, these three young guys in their 20s, to literally send a spaceship to the moon. That was like their project. We go through the whole story of how it all came about. And the reason we tell the story of the facts of the project have been well reported elsewhere. The part that we were more interested in is, A, how did these guys have the chutzpah to decide we're going to go do this? It's sort of crazy. And two, they didn't have a space agency behind them. They didn't have a big multinational tech company behind them. They couldn't put 2 shekels together to fund the registration fee to get into this contest, to try and pursue this. So how did they go about it? And what was clear is that every step of the way, they could get to anybody. They could get to the head of Israel's space agency. They could get to the heads of the biggest multinational companies in Israel. They could get to the most senior politicians. They could get to people who could fund them. Everyone in Israel knows everyone. Everyone feels like a 1 degree of separation from everyone, and everyone feels comfortable, reaching out with a WhatsApp message and just touching base. And when we first wrote it up, I shared it with an Israeli friend of mine, and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "It's not entirely accurate. You're overstating it. The way everybody, can reach everyone that's that easy." He goes, "It's not like that." He goes, "It's more like everyone's a cousin." I was like, "Okay, everyone's a cousin. Some cousins you're closer to than others, but any cousin who reaches out to you, you're going to be responsive to." And that's how everyone operates in the country. There's no caste system. There's very little hierarchy. It's a very anti-hierarchical society. So no one's too important to meet with, someone's too senior to meet with someone too junior. With the person you're talking about, Donna Stern is the person you quote, who was a big TV acquisitions person in Israel. She's the one who first purchased Fauda. She's the person who first discovered Shtisel. She's famous for putting these great Israeli shows and acquiring them and finding them a global audience. She used to work for Reuters as a journalist before she got into creative television. And she told me the story that's not in the book. She said that as part of her Reuters job, which was based in Tel Aviv, she would get sent to London every year to work out of Reuters for 2 weeks in London. And she said she'd go to London for 2 weeks and she'd go to the bureau, and everybody there knew she was not from London, that she was visiting, that she was working there, and she just assumed every single night someone else would invite her to their home for dinner, because that's just the way it works in Israel. You can barely know someone and you hear they're there and you're like, "Oh, come to..." And she would go every year for 2 weeks, and not once was she ever invited to a colleague's home for dinner. And she just found that bizarre. She says at her home, particularly on Shabbat, she has 3 kids. She sets up multiple settings for Shabbat dinner every Friday night when her kids are in the army. She goes, "I have no idea how many people they're going to come home with. It's just everyone invites everybody over, and you just got to be ready." And so that's the culture of the place. It's sort of everyone is a form. It's like a form of extended family. And
I want to touch on Shabbat, because it's a whole chapter of yours, and it again also resonated. You call it Thanksgiving every week. And again, Noah Tishby, who I think many
Yeah.
many know, her quote is, "If you don't come home for Shabbat, you're in deep trouble." That it really is embedded in the expectation of growing up in Israel. Can you talk about just how that ritual is kind of informs, again, Israel's not just its resilience in some ways?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite chapters in the book, Thanksgiving Every Week. And the reason we came up with that title is one of the problems when you dig into what's ailing the U.S. as a society, there's this loneliness crisis. There's a sense that people feel disconnected from community, and there's lack of ritual, right? There aren't rituals that people participate in on a regular basis with the people closest to them, that they also believe at the same time the whole country's participating in with their own families and communities. Mika Goodman, a public intellectual who we quote extensively in the book, had this line. He said, communities do not create rituals, rituals create communities. So you get community when there's a ritual that is sort of the stimulant or the catalyst. So we start to describe to Americans, in Israel, most of the country shuts down on Friday night. Now, that's certainly true for observant Jews in Israel. It's also true for non-observant Jews in Israel. Overwhelming majority of Israelis, in the 70s to 80% of the population, on Friday nights are with family and or close friends, usually multiple generations, 2 generations, 3 generations, sometimes even 4 generations. And some are, as I said, very observant and traditional, and they do all the blessings, and they bench, and they do it all. And some are totally secular, and they don't do anything, or they may just light the candles and say the Kiddush, but that's it. But the point is, they're together, and they slow down, and it's something that they're experiencing as a family, and that they're experiencing as a national collective, because they know most of the country is doing the same thing. So I described this scene, what a typical Friday night dinner looks like in Israel to many Americans. I said, what does this resemble to you? And they all said Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was the one time of year in the United States where they feel they're always with their family.
It's multi-generational.
It's multi-generational, and they know that the whole country's doing it. It's like most of American society is doing it. I said, great. I said, that's I love that. I feel the same way about Thanksgiving. I said, how often is it? Once a year. I said, okay, can you come up with a second example, like a second version of that? Because that's one day a year, that's not that much. And they're usually stuck when I ask that question. They can't come up with a second. The closest they can get to is
football.
Yeah, the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl. I know it sounds pathetic. It's true. They say the Super Bowl. And I kind of get what they mean, right? Because everyone's watching
national
it.
Conversation.
People are going to Super Bowl parties. They talk about the next day at the water cooler, So I said, okay, fine. So that's 2. That's 2. Again, imagine if you had it every single week. Yeah. And I think the role Shabbat plays in Israelis, and by the way, one of the things we focus on in the book is the number of rituals throughout the year in Israel. They are religious rituals like Shabbat and all the Jewish holidays. There are civic events, civic holidays, Yom HaZikaron, Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, Memorial Day. The way Israel commemorates those days is also extremely unique.
With the sirens and the getting out of your car.
And the whole country participates, right? Yeah. No matter where you are in Israel, when those sirens go off, everyone gets out in the car on the highway, everyone walks out of hotels and office buildings and classrooms, and there's just a whole sense for 2 minutes that the country stops. And in that moment, while that siren is going off, they're thinking about someone they lost. But there's also this national collective experience. And here we don't have many national collective experiences. And I think the frequency that Israel has, not only that it has them, but the frequency it has throughout its calendar helps kind of keep the country together even when it's really divided, or prevents it from really kind of going off the cliff when it's really divided. And it keeps people grounded with family and community, right? As Noah Tishby says, if you know every single week you're going to see your family, you're going to see the people closest to you, no matter how busy you are, no matter how important you are. Some interviews we did for this book, we would do on Fridays. It just so happened the way that's when some of the interviewees had the time to really slow down and spend a few hours with us. So they would invariably have us meet them at their home on a Friday because they're getting ready for Shabbat. So I won't mention all of their names, or any of them, but some of them are among the most powerful and influential people in Israel. And we would just go into their homes, and while we were interviewing them, we were watching the flurry of activity leading up to Friday night. And you realize, no matter how busy and important these people are, they have this grounding every single week.
Mika Goodman, who you mentioned, writer, thinker, he has a quote that I love that you say is very central to this idea, and it's that Israel is a small country with a big story. You wrote this book, obviously, before October 7th. It feels like his idea there is very relevant to the post-October 7th response of Israelis in terms of this story has now one of its darkest chapters, and how the society has responded. So can you kind of just, again, within the kind of paradigm of this book?
I love that explanation he gave us. I remember exactly where I was when he gave it to us. We're on a hike, actually. And that was
he made you hike.
Yeah,
right?
We were out of breath and we were like writing it down.
And what was before we get to the October 7th lens on it, what is the idea that he was getting at?
The idea is, well, he made the point to us that with Startup Nation, we described how Israel is doing better than it should, right? That given all the challenges Israel has, it's sort of punching above its weight on the global innovation economy, on these global innovation economy standards. It says, but what the thesis you're laying out here, it's not that Israel's doing better than, it's that the whole world is moving in the wrong direction and Israel's moving in the opposite direction. So he thought the contrast was even more stark. And he zeroed in on this idea that Israel, as you said, is a small country with a big story. So why does that matter? He says, look, there are plenty of small countries in the world, right? There are plenty of European countries that are small. And they're small countries with small stories, or small countries with medium-sized stories. It's nothing against them. But in terms of like the global scheme of world history, their narrative doesn't matter that much, other than how it, it impacts the few million people living in their country. And he says, and then there are big countries with big stories. China is a big country with a big story. The United States is a big country with a big story. But he says what makes Israel unique is it's a small country with a big story, which means its story really matters. It literally is of biblical proportions. I mean, so what happens in Israel matters, and debates that are happening in Israel are shaped by things that happened thousands of years ago, and God willing will be for thousands of years into the future. So the story's really big, and therefore the whole world is watching, not just Israelis. And because it's small, almost every Israeli feels that they can touch it. They can touch the country's history. They can touch the country's future. They can shape the country's future. It's not like, oh, I live in the United States, or I live in China, or I live in India, and there's this country's so massive, how much impact can I really have?
And there's a sense of responsibility.
Sense of responsibility, sense of ownership. That comes back to the earlier point about like the country has my back and I have its back, and I can do something. Like everybody can do something because it's small enough that I can actually touch it and shape it. And so I think that's a big reason why the country's so resilient.
And so when you look at October 7th and you see that idea of mutual responsibility and what you owe, it's not even just a sense of obligation. It's a sense of, I'm needed.
Right. So that, when we were writing this book, it was at the peak of the divide over judicial reform, those debates. And one of the reasons we wanted to push forward with the book was because we wanted to remind everyone, Israelis and people who care about Israel who are outside Israel, that it's going to be okay, that Israel will bounce back. The country, while it looks like it's tearing itself apart, it's been there before. It's had deeply divisive domestic debates, and we chronicle in the book a number of these debates throughout its history. But the country always kind of hangs together, and so that was what we were focused on. And we sort of laid out the kind of the societal shock absorbers inside Israel that prevent it from spinning apart. October 7th was like a case study in that, which is as divided as the country was on October 6th, and it was really divided on October 6th. The morning of October 7th, by the morning of October 7th, the leaders of the anti-government protest movement, the Brothers in Arms, the leaders in the high-tech community that created the infrastructure for the protest movement, basically got together like 10 a.m. Saturday morning, and they said, okay, we're done with that, with judicial reform, at least for now. We got to support the government. We got to work with the government. We got to lock arms with the government. There's going to be a ton of needs to support the reservists that are being called up, to fill holes in civilian services and functions that the government may not be able to handle. And within no time, you had literally tens of thousands of these people who had been at the forefront of the protest movement, working together, figuring out how to fill holes. They had contacted the Ministry of Defense and other offices within the government that day on Saturday, October 7th, to say, okay, we're here to help. We're here to put this massive infrastructure to work. Had the protest movement of pre-October 7th not happened, they probably would have had to build it to fill all the holes that needed filling. And it's eerie, and I've never articulated it this way until now, but it was almost like 2023 was like a dry run for a national crisis, because they had the infrastructure set up. They had the communications capabilities. They knew how to get everyone organized. They knew who was good at what, and they put it to work to support the war.
So finally, Dan, this is very much a book about Israel's optimism. And we're talking at a time when many Jews in America do not feel that optimism. How do you respond to that, the sense of peril or kind of precariousness now?
I think that all Israelis and all Jews who feel a connection to Israel anywhere in the diaspora are feeling a sense of trauma and a sense of uncertainty, which is obviously understandable. And it's going to feel that way, I think, for a very long time, because Israel's never really experienced anything like this. The closest you can compare it to is the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and I think this is much worse than the 1973 Yom Kippur. The only thing it has in common is that Israel was caught by surprise. But Israel bounced back pretty quickly in that war, and ultimately demonstrated enormous capabilities, much superior to its enemies, and Israel, had another 50 years or so after that were incredibly impressive as a result, in some respects, as a result of the way it bounced back in the Yom Kippur War. This feels worse than the Yom Kippur War. Like I said, the trauma is hard to imagine fading anytime soon. I worry that Israel's military and intelligence capabilities may have been exposed or be interpreted as a paper tiger in the region, which is terrible for Israel if that persists. That's why it's very important that Israel respond strongly and demonstrate that it can secure its borders and that it's not a paper tiger. But I think the most important story here for people who care about Israel is, even in this trauma, you have Israelis of all walks of life, and I mean all walks of life, coming together in ways, even though we write about some of it and we predict some of it, and so I'm an optimist about Israel, I couldn't have imagined. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the fault lines in the debate over judicial reform that was dividing the country was the role of the Haredim, of the ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society. I mean, one of the more obvious ones was, do they or don't they serve in the military? Or do they feel a connection to the state? Are they almost like a tribe in the country that the rest of the country are citizens of a state, and then they're the Haredim that are separate from the state? And there's story after story, and we see some of the trends of that in the book, but obviously there's been much more of it since October 7th, of the Haredim rallying to the state, in some cases showing up and volunteering to serve in the military. Hold debate, should they be exempted? Should they not be exempted? And now they're overwhelming the IDF enlistment centers because of they're wanting to serve. And even the ones that aren't serving. I heard this one story where there was this impromptu military base set up to house a bunch of the reservists that were going to be going into Gaza, and there was a Haredi yeshiva not far from that, and the students in the yeshiva heard that the soldiers were in this base, and there was the terrible conditions, and they spoke to the rabbis and the people who run the program. They said, we'll evacuate our dorms, let the soldiers turn this into their base. Story after story. You look even in the, every Friday I look on social media, because there's some amazing images from these soldiers serving together, and you see these images of how they celebrate Shabbat. And they're in the hull of a tank, and you'll have, you see the challah, you see the wine, you see them saying the Kiddush, but you look around and you're like, okay, so that guy's clearly very religious, right? And that guy is very not religious, tattoo, earring, whatever, you know what I mean? And that guy is a Jew from the East, and that's a Jew from the West, and that's a Jew. I mean, you certainly look at this one looks much more hip and comfortable. You know, he may be the son of a tech entrepreneur, and this one is like the son of a cab driver. And they're all in the hull of a tank doing Shabbat together, and you're reminded that even in a moment of trauma, an enormous challenge, Israel has these systems like national service that keep these disparate and diverse parts of the country together and prevents them from seeing each other as the other. And so it not only gives them tremendous skills in their life that, these young people at formative years in their lives are learning how to lead and to manage and all these skills that the Army teaches them, but it also just keeps them together. And
again, that sense of shared project.
Shared purpose. So that's why, and you can go on and on and on about all these different fault lines. Even the Israeli-Arab community, we have a chapter in the book on the Israeli-Arab community, and we met with some Israeli-Arab leaders who are already talking about feeling some connection to Israel. Now it's complicated with the Israeli-Arab community because they feel part of the country, yet it's clearly a Jewish state, and they're not Jewish, and yet post-October 7th, the sense of solidarity that Israeli Arabs are feeling, you even see it in the data. The Israel Democracy Institute is out with a poll now that shows that Israeli Arabs feel a sense of solidarity. Many of them have been killed, held hostage, and are participating in different ways, some direct, some indirect, in the response to October 7th from a security standpoint.
You meaning that there were Arab victims of October? I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yes, Israeli Arabs who were killed on October 7th by Hamas. Right. And so you have someone like Lucy Arash, who's this Israeli Arab news anchor in Israel, who goes on television and says, I stand with my fellow citizens of Israel. I do not stand with that. And that's barbarism. This is civilization. I'm part of civilization. And so, again, I just think Israel has these, as I said, these societal shock absorbers, this infrastructure that holds the country together, even when they're disagreeing, even when they're arguing, or even when they're hit with a major war.
Thank you, Dan. The book is The Genius of Israel, and it is out now, and it's a book for generations. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
I'm Abigail Pogrebin. This is In the Spotlight, and I'll see you next time.